In this video, we will be dealing with the vocab-in-context question, which I have reproduced right here to tell you or give you a sense of exactly what I'm talking about. There's the vocab. It's taken from the passage, hence there's quotation marks around it. Now in a second, we'll actually go through this question and I will excerpt the relevant part of the passage. But here, of course, is the format, and it's important to note that this question type can occur with the same frequency in the easy, medium, or hard sections. So you should definitely be prepared for it. There probably won't be more than 2 per verbal section, but there will definitely be 1. The strategy is to treat this question type like a text completion, which sounds kind of weird because it doesn't look like anything like a text completion and you already have a reading passage. What I mean, though, is I want you to pretend you never saw that word casts, which I referenced a second ago, and take it out of the passage and then substitute your own word into the passage without actually looking at the answer choices. And I think this is the biggest temptation and the biggest mistake that students make on this question type. Because what happens is the test writers really diligently and carefully choose an answer choice that seems to work. However, it can A, be slightly off, B, it can describe the sentence in general, but not the specific word in the blank. Or C, it can actually work logically in the sentence, however, it is not a dictionary definition of the word that's in quotation marks. And that's subtle, and this point only really applies to the hardest vocabulary in context questions, but it's always important to note that the word being used there, in the case casts, must have a dictionary definition that matches up with the correct answer. Of course, it's also important to note that the first word that leaps to your mind when you think of cast is probably not the right answer, as we're going to see here in a second. So, in the context in which it appears, cast most nearly means. So definitely do not think I see it cast. To cast something out, to throw out, that must be the answer. We must, of course, look at the context. Now, what's tempting, though, of course, is to read the entire sentence, and say, okay, but he also... And then, right, when you get to cast, start with A. Describes many of his tales in modern settings. Well, it kind of works. Kind of describe things. Okay, maybe. Questions. Well, that doesn't work. Sets. That could kind of work. E. Explores many of his tales. I like that because he's exploring them. And then you choose E. However, E is not the correct answer because it's not a dictionary definition of cast. Now, to avoid using explores or ending up with the wrong answer choice, we want to, again, treat this like a text completion. Now look what I've done. Aha! Making you come up with your own word. Let's try that here. Not only does T sprinkle snippets of his native Yoruba and Nigerian inflected English and introduce Yoruban grammatical structures into sentences containing only English, but he also blanks many of his tales in modern settings. I like sets. Sets makes perfect sense. However, when you get to the answer choices, you can easily go past sets and end up on explores. Notice they're putting there at the very end because it kind of works, but it definitely is not a dictionary definition, and it's not, of course, even the word that we came up with. Set works much better, but it's harder to see if you're just plugging words back into the question, or rather into the excerpted passage. Now, let's have another look at a vocab-in-context question. This one is going to be a little bit more difficult, but let's follow the same strategy. This time, I'm not going to be so nice as to actually set up our little text completion and get rid of the answer choices. I want you to get used to doing the correct method, even though the answers are so temptingly just waiting there for you to plug them in. Ignore them. Figure out where the word is. Here's a nap. I'm going to put a little red mark through it. And read the sentence and try to come up with your own word. And you can pause the video now to do so. Okay, let's read the sentence together. Both sides, however, misinterpret T's work by placing it in the tradition of novels, a classification that becomes, I like the word wrong. It's a simple word, and the simpler the better when coming up with our own word. Works perfectly fine. Now let's go to the answer choices. Curious. If something is curious, it's interesting. Is that the same as wrong? No. Inappropriate. If something is inappropriate, is it wrong? More or less. Let's keep that there. Sensational. By definition, if something is sensational, is it wrong? Well, no, it could be wrong, but it is not by definition wrong. If something is controversial, is it wrong? Again, very similar to sensational. It's not quite wrong. If something's controversial, you may agree with it and think it's very much right. And therefore, you can see that controversial is one of those answer choices that you could plug back into the sentence over here at the top and convince yourself that it is the answer. E, misguided, is also one of those in which you can convince yourself it's the answer if you are not careful and go through the method here of coming up with your own word. Why? Well, misguided. Clearly, both sides here are misguided. But what are we looking for? We are not looking for a word that describes a general context, but the sentence specifically right there, that word, inapt, what word needs to go there, it is wrong or inappropriate, and that's how you work these question types. In this video, we will deal with a rare question type on the GRE reading section, and that is called the select the sentence question. This question type does not have any answer choices. It is a question, and what you have to do upon reading it is to actually hover over the passage and select the sentence that best answers the question. The passage will actually highlight, and that's why this question type is sometimes called highlight the passage question. But what you'll do is make your mouse hover over a sentence. That sentence will become highlighted, and then you will go and confirm your answer, given that the sentence you're currently highlighting is the answer to the question. Now, we actually don't have that cool technology on this video lesson, but we'll actually go through a question and pretend that we are highlighting a passage. Now, what you have to know is that the select the sentence question requires you to understand the structure of the passage and specifically the function of the sentences within the passage. Now that sounds pretty intimidating, and it's actually a lot more straightforward than that. You will see the question, you will see that it is on a specific topic within the passage, and you will look for that topic, and then you will usually come across the sentence. That first sentence, however, is usually incorrect. It kind of allows you to anchor yourself within the text because it mentions words that are in the question. So you actually have to look at the sentences around that anchor sentence because those are the ones that typically answer the question. And so there's oftentimes this superficial, it mentions words in the question itself, that traps a lot of students. And that therefore maybe 50% of students get it wrong. Maybe only 40%, but again, it's not a very difficult question type because there's only usually two possible sentences it could be. So what I've done here is I've provided us with a question and also taken the liberty of excerpting the two relevant sentences. So I've assumed we've gone through that really long passage on Tutola and you've come across these two sentences. They actually follow each other, but I've provided a space in between here. So let's read the question. Select the sentence in the passage that describes how T is able to be creative while working in the confines of the Nigerian folkloric tradition. So you scan the passage and you see this sentence right here and you notice, aha, inventive embellishments, that's being creative. Working in the confines, aha, you read down a constraints here. You make that connection and you say that must be the answer. This, of course, is the distractor, the wrong answer choice. It's using words from the question, the topic from the question itself, to fool you. Because what is the question actually asking? It's saying to select the sentence that describes how T is able to do so, not the fact that he actually does so. So what specific examples do we have of this sentence? And therefore we read the next sentence and we find out that Tutola here sprinkles snippets of his native language and Nigerian inflected English, all while working within these constraints. And therefore you can see, aha, this is the sentence that answers the question. And of course you will put the mouse cursor over it, that sentence will highlight, and then you will go to confirm the answer. In this lesson video, we will go over a question type that is specific to the GRE reading comprehension section. That is, you won't see it anywhere else on any other test. This question type is called the multiple answer question. I like to sometimes call it the MAQ. How do we know we are dealing with the MAQ? Well, there are exactly three answer choices, A, B, and C, that follow the question. There is no D and E. These answer choices have these brackets around them. So you'll have A, followed by B, followed by C. any one of these three answer choices can be correct. So you could mark A, or perhaps the answer is also B. Sometimes the answer is all three of them, or sometimes the answer is just one of them. Now, how we go about this from a strategy standpoint is that what I've noticed is that the answer choices in this multiple answer question take a little bit more time to sift through. They're not as obviously wrong as some of the answer choices are on our 5-answer multiple choice questions. So they take a little bit longer, these questions, and from a pacing standpoint, you may want to sometimes skip a multiple answer question if you are short on time to go to a question type that maybe doesn't take quite so long. Of course, you have to go carefully through each answer choice, as I mentioned, otherwise you will miss something important. Of course, this is more time consuming, so again, go back to or go on to another question type. As for the general strategy approach, it's basically the same. Read the question, go to the relevant part of the passage, and find that evidence. Make sure your answer is based on that evidence. Today, I have for us a very difficult passage. Passages so far in this reading comprehension module have been easy, medium, maybe medium difficult with the oligodendrocytes and the rats and the humans. This one, though, is something you'd see on the hard section. Now, I don't want you to become discouraged. What we're going to do is we're going to actually apply the techniques we've learned so far to this pretty difficult passage. As you can see, it's a medium passage, and what I want you to do is, of course, to read it, but after you're done reading it, I want you to write down the primary purpose, why the author wrote that passage, and then 3 important points. So I'm going to take us back to the slide, and you should pause it. Okay, I assume you're done with that. Write down the primary purpose, and then 3 important points. Okay, primary purpose. What you've written doesn't actually have to mirror what I've written word for word, but the gist has to be the same. Primary purpose was to provide evidence that A.T., notice I'm not putting his full name down because it's difficult to pronounce, is not a novelist but works in the Nigerian folklore tradition. So that's the part of the passage because it says that scholars on both sides of the debate fail to recognize this. So then the author tells us a little bit about the NFT, or the Nigerian folklore tradition. Notice I'm using shorthand there. NFT is about adding liberal embellishments, and he provides evidence for how A.T. does this. For instance, A.T. uses modern settings and operates within the constraints of the story. So there it is. These are 3 important points. Maybe you saw another important aspect of the passage, but it should probably in some way relate to what we have written here. On an actual passage, you want to get used to either coming up with even a better shorthand than this, or using the mental snapshot so that you've, in your head, come up with what the passage looks like, what these important points are, and of course what the primary purpose is. So there it is again. And the reason I'm showing it to you is so you can come back, pause it, and read from here once you've actually read this question. Once you've read this question and attempted to answer it, then we will go through each answer choice and we will see which one is right and which one is wrong. And remember, more than one can be right. And notice here, of course, the brackets around each answer choice. Okay, I assume that you have gone over the passage and you have taken a look at each of the answer choices. Remember, carefully going through each one. The first thing I would do, though, is a strategy that we learned at the very beginning, which is if the question is difficult, don't keep rereading the question, going to the passage, going back, rereading it again, because that's going to waste time and it's going to make you confused. Slow down, look at the question, and try to put it into your own words. So I will read the question. Which of the following provides defense against those who believe that A.T. diminishes the original tales recast in his book? In other words, how are those who claim T.A. ruins the original stories, how are they wrong? And the correct answer, or answers, will give us a reason why these people are wrong. So let's start with answer choice A. Again, I'm showing you here the passage, so in case you want to take another look at it, there it is, pause it. Okay. T. I'm just going to call him T, was aware of how his work was consistent with the idiom in which he was working. So he wasn't just going about ruining his stories, and I find the evidence here. T is highly aware of the tradition in which he is working. Therefore, in his retelling, he is not ruining the original story, because this tradition, of course, is about adding embellishments, which we have here in answer choice B. Embellishments are integral to the folkloric tradition T inhabits. And here we have the evidence that the teller of folk tales is admired for the ability to add this unique voice and the embellishments, etc. So, therefore, these two are right. What about the last one, though? Tutola's works deviate from the novel's typical form. Now, you can find evidence from this, or at least this is mentioned in the passage. It's not completely out of left field. But this is in the context of those who misunderstand T, who say, oh, well, his novels aren't like the typical novel. And on the other side of that, they say, oh, well, his novel is actually a daring experimentation against the novel's typical form. And so in a way, both of those sides agree that his works deviate from the novel's typical form. What we want to do is to disagree with one of those sides, to show that one of those sides is wrong in claiming that T ruins the story in the retelling. Again, he doesn't. He's working within the Nigerian folkloric tradition. So this is not a defense, and therefore the answers would be both A and B. So that's, again, getting very specific to this passage. The takeaway from this is to go slowly, to look for the evidence, to remember the question, what's being asked, and to paraphrase it if necessary. Broader strategy is these do take time, and in fact, in the next video, you're going to see the multiple answer question, inference question, which takes even more time. So again, big picture strategy is skip these questions if you're running short on time and move on to something that doesn't take quite so long. But if you're going to take a stab at it, be careful and look for your evidence. Welcome to the multiple answer inference question. It's an important question type because the test writers like to put inference questions in the MAQs, the multiple answer questions, often. So that's why I gave it a separate video. Now this doesn't look like our typical intro here with this massive text. The reason I put this here is just to refamiliarize you with the text if you've forgotten it. Now if you're fresh from the other lesson videos using this text, no need to worry. But if not, pause and read. Okay, let's actually dive in to the intro here on Inference MAQ or multiple answer questions. Now the inference question in general is pretty common on MAQs, but especially at the higher level, you'll get a bunch of them. And that's because they're tricky, they're hard, and the test writers know this. So they, in order to make a tough GRE verbal section with a reading comp passage, throw in a couple of inference MAQs. And so it's good to keep in mind, especially if you are aiming for that harder verbal section. What's also important here is that inferences haven't changed from the inference videos. It's really the same thing. So what was that? Well, an inference question is something that is airtight. The answer can be defended, and it's not a kind of wishy-washy, well, I think I could infer that sort of kind of. When you hear that logic in your head, then you know that you're probably dealing with something that's most likely not the answer. Again, going back to number one, an inference should be pretty airtight. So what I've done here is, based on that passage, I've come up with some inferences. Your rule here is to say, is this a valid GRE inference or not valid? Let's read the first one. Tutola never attempted to write a book that adhered to Western standards of novel form. Now from the passage, we might remember that he wrote in this Nigerian folkloric tradition, something very specific, and so his works weren't really novels. And so it seems like, yeah, he probably didn't write many books that were your typical novels. But look at that word never. Look how extreme that is. When you have an extreme answer in an inference answer choice, it makes it difficult to back up because remember, it has to be airtight. But when you're making something so extreme, so black and white, it's hard to say, yes, that is definitely the case. So this is not a valid inference because maybe Tutola did write a book. He did attempt to write a book that was along the Western standards or in line with the Western standards. But in this passage, we just happen to be talking about the books that he wrote that were in a different style than the Western novel form. Okay, next up. Tutola is one of the more well-known writers operating in the Nigerian folkloric tradition. So take a second. Again, valid or not valid for the GRE. Okay, this one is not valid. Why is it not valid? Well, he might be. They're talking about him, right? So he's probably pretty popular. He's probably one of the more well-known. How many times did I use probably just now? Well, a few. And I could have used might, or probably. I used probably, obviously. But some other word that shows that I'm not 100% sure. And therefore, this is not a valid inference. Okay, let's look at this one. All tales told in the Nigerian folkloric tradition end with the author addressing his or her audience in an omniscient voice. Now the text says that Tutola ends his tales in or by using an omniscient voice as part of the Nigerian folkloric tradition. But can we make that jump, again, to the extreme, the all? And that's where things get a little dicey. Maybe there's this other guy who works in Nigerian folkloric tradition but doesn't necessarily end in an omniscient voice. Maybe that's okay to do. You see, we're getting to that maybe gray area, and that's not a valid inference. So, what does a valid inference look like on the GRE multiple answer question types? Well, one, that is at least one of these, must be the answer. So one of these is a valid inference. Maybe two are, maybe all three are. It's up for you to decide. But of course, we don't have photographic memories. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let you look here, read the question, look at answer choice A. There is no overlap in the devices found in the Nigerian folkloric tradition and those found in the traditional novel. And I'm going to give it to you. There's the passage. So pause it. Okay, I assume you've paused it. You've found that relevant part to help you answer A. Now, I'm going to do the same for B. But before I move on to B, whether or not A is the answer, you should tell me if it's not the answer, why it's not the answer. And the same for B. So read B. I assume you've done that. And now, now you should pause it. Okay, assuming you've paused it, let's do the final one for C, situating a traditional Nigerian tale. So I assume you've read that. And now we can go to the passage. Okay, I assume you've paused it and found the information for C. So we're all done with the slide. We're going to jump over the passage and start with A. There is no overlap in the devices found in the Nigerian folkloric tradition and those found in the traditional novel. Again, we're in extreme territory. No overlap. It doesn't seem like there's much overlap. And maybe there is no overlap. But to be able to infer that based on what is said is simply not the case. A is too extreme. A is out. B, a characteristic of tales in the Nigerian folkloric tradition is that they conclude with an instructive moral. I've excerpted the relevant text. It says here, indeed, Tutola is highly aware of the tradition in which he is working and would be loath or reluctant to describe his work as adhering to the novel form. And they give an example of the tradition in which he is working. He closes out each tale by assuming an omniscient voice and didactic tone. Didactic means instructive, good to know vocabulary. So we can say, aha, we can infer that because the text is right there and it says he's working in this tradition, and an example is he does or closes out the novel with an instructive moral. Therefore, that must be a characteristic. Notice it doesn't say a characteristic of every single tale or all tales. That's when we start to get into the extreme land. But it says a characteristic of tales, and therefore you can infer that. Let's take a look at C. Situating a traditional Nigerian tale in a modern setting would not violate the constraints of the Nigerian folkloric tradition. Let's look at the text. Tell me, and you might want to pause the video again. Can you infer this or not infer this? Well, we have here that, in general, the Nigerian folklore tale or folk tale teller uses and is expected to use inventive embellishments and to impart a unique voice as long as they're working within those well-known constraints. And so they give an example. What does Tutola do? He sprinkles snippets of his native Yoruba and Nigerian inflected English. That's some of his unique voice. And then he also casts many of his tales in a modern setting. That follows in the inventive embellishments. Therefore, situating or setting a traditional Nigerian tale in a modern setting would not violate the constraints of Nigerian folkloric tradition. That's part of the constraints he's operating under, putting something in a modern setting. It says right there, of course, and we can match this up pretty well with C, and there is our answer. So remember, Be careful of the oh, maybe, could kind of work. These extreme answer choices. Make sure that you back up your answer with information in the text. Over the next couple of videos, I'm going to be using this passage instead of the other one that I was using on the Nigerian writer Tutola. So I encourage you to read this, and indeed you may actually recognize this from the very beginning. One of the lesson videos we talked about what a GRE passage is, and this happens to be this exact passage. So if you want to read it, please pause the video now. Okay, let's actually go to what the point of this lesson is about, and that is the structure question, which is a question that asks about a specific function of a sentence within the passage and how that sentence relates to the other sentences around it. So here's an example. Which of the following best describes the primary function of the third sentence? Asks us about a specific sentence. So what we do in terms of an approach, this is important because it's very easy to just reread this sentence right here called the reference sentence and then dive into the answer choices. Do not do that. Instead, read the reference sentence and then describe it in your own words. Simplify that sentence. Next, read the sentence before the reference sentence and then in your own words describe what the function of the reference sentence is. I know that last part sounds a little convoluted, so what we're going to do in the next few slides is to go over each approach. So let's start here with read reference sentence and then describe it in your own words. Here it is. The reference sentence is the third sentence. The Sea River, the main river passing through La Venta, could have had notable tributaries diverted as a result of a catastrophic earthquake, leading to not only severe flooding in certain areas, but also a lack of sufficient water for subsistence crops. And I'll kind of stop there. There's a lot going on, but simplifying it isn't too difficult. It talks about a river that changed its course because of a big earthquake, and now they have problems with crops. Again, we're not writing this down, but we're doing these little mental snapshots. A big earthquake could have caused river to become diverted, leading to loss of crops. Now we have that. We go to the second strategy, which is to read the sentence before the reference sentence, meaning sentence number 2, and then describe what the function of the reference sentence is. So we're not simplifying the sentence before, we're just reading it. Much of this research, however, has overlooked the role that changing geography, most notably the course of rivers, played. And then in our own words, we came up with, well, the sentence right after this sentence, sentence number 3, was about a big earthquake could have caused the river to become diverted. Aha, all this is doing is offering support to this hypothesis up here. So the function, it gives an example of the change in geography. And so if this were an easy question, or even a somewhat medium level question, A could be the answer. It provides an example supporting the theory regarding geographical changes. Perfectly fine answer. Now, if this was a harder section, the answer may be a little bit more subtle. And what the test writers do on these structure questions is to use a little bit vaguer language. Instead of mentioning geographical changes, they kind of hide that fact and talk at things at a very abstract or high level. So I've come up with 4 entirely new answer choices, one of which is the answer. We'll just pretend A was some other random answer that was completely wrong, so we've gotten rid of it. And what I want you to do is now pause the video and, using the technique, which you really don't have to do since we did it together, but remembering what we came up with using the technique, see if you can answer the question. Okay, I assume you've paused the video to do so. Let's take a look at B. To provide direct support for a theory that is mentioned in the first sentence. You can see now how sneaky the test writers can be, because what? First sentence. Wait a second. Sentence 3 was providing direct support for a theory mentioned in the second sentence. Therefore, first sentence is not correct and B is wrong. C, to introduce the role meteorological conditions played in the change in crop subsistence patterns. We've shifted from meteorological to geographical, so out with C. D, to highlight evidence offered up by most scholarship on the disappearance of the Olmec. It says much of this research, however, has overlooked this, what we're talking about here. Not that much scholarship is actually devoted to it, so that's kind of the opposite. Leaving us with E, to provide a specific example supporting a hypothesis that differs from that, meaning the hypothesis, be clear that that means the hypothesis mentioned in the first sentence. kind of convoluted, kind of confusing. Definitely not the answer that we came up with. But by doing a little dissecting, we can see that, well, it does provide support for a hypothesis that's mentioned in the second sentence. And of course, that hypothesis differs from the hypothesis mentioned in the first sentence, and therefore E is our answer. So the takeaway here again is to follow that strategy, but especially in harder sections, be prepared for more of this abstract language, such as direct support for a theory or examples supporting a hypothesis or to highlight evidence, and also be prepared for these little twists here, such as we saw in B, where they're trying to confuse us, and make sure that on the answer choice E that you're able to follow the twists and turns of the answer choice itself, because oftentimes the correct answer will have those twists and turns. This video will go over an advanced question type, which I call the if-then. And what I have here, of course, is the passage in which we will use a specific if-then question. So you might want to pause the video and refamiliarize yourself with this passage. Okay, let's talk specifically about the if-then. The phrase, which of the following, if true, would. That is the if-then question type. What follows is usually a theory, and a weakening of the theory or a supporting of the theory. It's very simple or similar to the paragraph argument question, where you are weakening or, in some cases, strengthening the argument. In this case, we have undermine, which means to weaken. So which of the following, if true, would weaken the theory the author of the passage provides for the sudden disappearance of the Olmec? The issue here is you want to go back and go straight into the answer choices, dive into them, and look for something that sounds familiar. What you don't want to do is to actually force yourself to go back to the passage and look for what the question is talking about. We have here a theory. There's a theory the author provides about the sudden disappearance of the Olmec. That's why it's a good idea when you actively read to remember where that is mentioned. It is mentioned towards the end. Here is his theory. So you go back and you read this. And after reading that, don't rush back down to the answer choices, but take that quick mental snapshot by describing the theory in your own words. And here's are my own words, and I'm guessing yours shouldn't be too different. In fact, you can even write yours down before looking at mine. And here they are. Olmec couldn't adapt to ecological changes because people didn't trust leadership, so feuding began. Obviously a terribly written sentence. That's not the point. You're just trying to get the gist. And I think this covers the main point in very few words. Now the point of doing this is it's going to be a lot easier to evaluate the answer choices when you have this in your head. You know what the theory is. But there's an extra step that will make things even easier. And that is to actually anticipate what the right answer must look like. Based on this, that the Olmec couldn't adapt to ecological changes because people didn't trust leadership, well, one way to weaken that is people did trust leadership, or that they did successfully adopt or adapt to ecological changes. And so what we're going to do is anticipate the answer. It must look something like this. Olmec were able to adapt to changes, but something else caused their downfall. Or Olmec leadership was successful, but something else caused the downfall. So now let's keep that there, our anticipated answer, and let's go through each one of the answer choices. A. Some of the flooding that resulted came not from any diverted tributaries, but from rainfall that intensified over the course of a decade. So now it's saying that flooding wasn't a result of geographical changes, but of meteorological changes. This talks back to the very beginning of this passage and doesn't really quite speak directly to the theory that the author has come up with. And so it's tempting because it speaks about some other part of the passage, but it's not what we are dealing with. And also the fact that some of the flooding resulted not from diverted tributaries doesn't mean that some of the flooding did come from diverted tributaries. So out with E. B. Not all the major subsistence crops were planted along the Sea River. Okay, even if that is the case, maybe a lot of the major subsistence crops were planted along the Sea River, and therefore the flooding that resulted, whether from diverted tributaries or otherwise, caused some major issues in subsistence crops. Had it said all the major subsistence crops were planted along, or none of the major subsistence crops were planted along the Sea River, that would have been slightly different. Then perhaps that would be a valid answer, or at least somewhat close. Let's take a look at C. Internal descent was long offered as a theory for the disappearance of the Mayans, but in recent years there has been near unanimous agreement that this disappearance can most likely be attributed to meteorological phenomenon. Be really careful here. I know there are a lot of words in here, but you should probably notice where it mentions the Mayans. We're dealing with the Olmec. And so what happened to the Mayans isn't really relevant. Sure, they also disappeared, but they were different people. So out with C. D. As a result of major ecological change, the Olmec split into several groups that were in persistent conflict over diminished resources. So what is D saying? D is telling us exactly what the author's theory is. As a result of this change, they split into groups and they were in conflict. We want to weaken this theory. Remember, we want to say that Olmec were able to adapt to the changes. They weren't necessarily in persistent conflict, but something else caused their downfall. Let's take a look at E. The Olmec leadership successfully relocated settlements near one of the new tributaries of the Sea River, yet years of constant flooding brought on by heavy rains precluded the growth of subsistence crops. So, by relocating settlements and the crops, they were able to adapt to the ecological changes. So leadership, it implies that leadership was effective. What got them was this constant flooding that kept on going on, and they could never build or grow crops, the crops that they needed to subsist or to exist on. They weren't able to do so. And therefore, that is the additional factor. That's something else that caused their downfall, and therefore that would most undermine the author's theory. So again, to run through what we did, we read the question, we knew the question type, which of course is the if-then, and we went for the theory. What is this theory? Because again, a lot of these if-thens, if not most of them, will deal with some theory, weakening or strengthening it. We read what that theory is, we simplified it in our own words, and then we anticipated the answer, going through each one of the answer choices to find the best one.